The auctioneer's voice flowed like oil over polished stone. Lot 001, it intoned, resonators in the RX Spire's grand chamber, giving the words a weight they did not deserve. 7 billion sentients, fully documented. Condition, varied. Provenance, multi-regional conflicts, debt defaults, failing states. Species mix is listed in your private catalogs. Reserve price has been agreed by all sponsoring powers. The chain markets of the Oryx Spire were silent. In the tiers below, Akari lords in living armor, Threxil corporate directors in glimmering exosuits, Kolthar war champions bristling with ceremonial spike gear, and hundreds of lesser dignitaries watched the holofield that hovered over the pit. Figures ran up one side of the projection: species codes, average lifespan, labor compatibility indexes, projected revenue curves. In the silent concourse high above, where no sound from the floor could rise unaided, a knot of humans stood behind transparent shielding and listened through a private feed. Envoy Sunam's hands were folded very neatly before her, the way she had trained herself to stand when everything inside was shaking. Her dark eyes tracked the rising numbers in the cold notations, and her mind supplied images that the auction deliberately omitted. Faces pressed against bulkhead grates, a child's hand reaching through a collar, the slow, reflexive flinches of people who had been struck too often to notice. Behind her, Admiral Halberg stood with the stiff patience of a man whose whole being strained against standing still. To the other observers in the concourse, he looked like exactly what he wished to project: a solid, controlled military commander in understated dress blacks, bare of decoration except for an old earth metal insignia at his collar. Inside, his thoughts moved like a storm front over an ocean. 7 billion. He had seen numbers like that on damage projections before, back when he was a junior officer staring at casualty forecasts for speculative planetary wars that had never come. But in every model he had studied, those souls had been abstractions. These were not. Beside him, Tavi Okoye had a neural band around her temples, faint blue light ticking at the edges as she let the Atlas Exchange's filtered data stream through her mind. She was not staring at the hollows. Her eyes were turned inward, watching fluctuations in flux credit liquidity curves, latency spikes, option cascade thresholds. Atlas itself, nothing so simple as a core or a single system, but a mesh of quantum-linked processing nodes tied into hyperwave exchanges across half the known galaxy, processed at a speed no conscious mind could follow. Tavi let herself ride only the topmost wave of its output, enough to guide, not enough to drown. She did not look at the projected faces either. She had forced herself not to. Not now. If she allowed in what was at stake, her hands might shake. If her hands shook, she might miss an inflection in a data trend. If she missed an inflection, we proceed as soon as they call the first bid, Lyra said softly, not turning. Understood, Tavi answered. Her voice was flat, but not from lack of emotion. It was the sound of something clamped down almost to breaking. On a distant dais across the arena, a serene mediator, tall and robed and surrounded by a haze of legal data streams only they could see, raised one delicate frond to signal. The sponsors, the auctioneer continued, have agreed that this lot shall be offered as a single unit in the interests of restoring market stability and efficiency. As a reminder, all sentients in this lot are presently under lawful bonds registered with the Serene Archives. Transfer of ownership will be recorded and enforced. The Serene mediator disliked the phrasing. The thought passed through their mind like the brush of a cool current against a warmer one, but they did not speak. Their duty, as always, was to the accords. In accordance with the terms submitted, opening bid is set at, the number rang out, translated into a dozen languages, propagated with perfect clarity. In the silent concourse, a faint tick appeared at the corner of Admiral Halberg's jaw. Lyra remembered another hall on another world, air thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and human sweat, and a different kind of decision being made. It had not started here. It had started on Maro's Reach, when humanity first learned what the rest of the galaxy considered acceptable. On Maro's Reach, the sky was thick with orbital infrastructure, squat logistics hubs, skeletal shipyards, constellations of traffic beacons. At dusk, when the light from the old star slanted just so, they glimmered like a second, artificial firmament. In one of the upper administrative towers, a Threxil delegation waited. They were efficient, the Threxil. Their lead envoy's exosuit was a gleaming carapace of articulated crystal and smart metal, trimmed just enough in gold sheen to display wealth without violating their internal codes of frugality. Their eye clusters tracked every movement in the room at once. Human aides moved with practiced haste, setting out drinks and data slates, sending last-minute messages. The translator bots waited in a decorative recess, non-sapient and compliant, ready to render the greeting scripts. When Admiral Halberg entered, the Threxil focused 3 eyes on him and 3 on the room monitors, cataloging insignia, making note of the empty spaces where medals might have been. A representative of armed capability, the Threxil envoy observed through the translator's neutral voice. A representative of responsibility, Halberg replied pleasantly, taking his seat. Welcome to Marrow's Reach. I hope our hospitality has met your expectations. Acceptable, the envoy said. Among the Threxil, that was praise. Your species has demonstrated rapid adaptation to standard galactic protocols. This bodes well for mutual profitability. Mutual profitability. In that phrase lay the heart of Threxil ethics. A deal that did not generate profit on both sides was uninteresting, but only if profits were properly tallied. The presentation began. Flux credit bonds, shipping agreements, technology transfers. A dozen screens blossomed with projections of increasing curves. The Threxil highlighted strategic partnerships with entities that spanned sectors, transportation syndicates, raw material brokers, financial houses. And then, sliding in with the casual precision of an efficient algorithm, came the page that soured the air. Additionally, the envoy said, we offer structured instruments backed by biological assets with yields exceeding standard rate by up to 14%. As you can see, these instruments have been validated by the Serene archives, with full biometric and contractual documentation. On the main display, the euphemism blossomed into detail. Biological assets, labor pools, contractual terms, indefinite. Mortality risk drivers, adjustable revenue projections, robust. There were images, too small to show faces clearly, but not so small that the shape of a cage could be mistaken for anything else. Halberg felt a physical sensation, as if an invisible pressure had just clamped around his rib cage. His heartbeat slowed, then struck harder. At the far end of the table, the civilian trade minister's expression did not change. She had been warned in briefings. Humanity had known, in the abstract, that slavery was not merely present in galactic society, but foundational to much of its structure. It was one thing to read that sentence on a report. It was another to see the investors' glossaries in which lives were columns on a balance sheet. Our analysts, the Threxil envoy went on, have estimated that integration of such instruments into your market could increase overall liquidity by 12% within 12 standard years. Given your expansion needs, this is a conservative projection. There is significant demand for such assets among. He broke off, noticing that his human guests were not reacting in the expected ways. The trade minister's palms were flat on the table. Her voice when she spoke was carefully measured. Could you clarify, she said, the exact terms under which these assets are acquired? Standard, the envoy replied, faintly puzzled. War capture, debt contract, penal labor, all compliant with regional statutes. We have no interest in black market stocks. Their documentation is unreliable, and resale openings are limited. So, the minister's thumb rubbed once along the table edge. You are proposing we invest in bonds whose stability is predicated on the continued enslavement of sentient beings. The envoy's exosuit flicked quicksilver patterns down its limbs, a Threxil gesture of discomfort with social irrationality. We are proposing proven financial products, it said. Biological assets prefer structured management. They are, on average, more productive and less vulnerable under such systems than as independent agents. Halberg's self-control, disciplined through decades, held. His face remained composed, his posture relaxed, but in his mind something old and bitter uncoiled. Not rage, not yet. Something more precise. Calculation. How did one rewrite a system that treated this as normal? Admiral, the trade minister said, turning her head slightly, inviting his input as if this were simply another line item. He met her eyes. She saw, in that instant, that his answer would not be tailored for diplomatic convenience. Thank you, he said to her, then looked back at the Threxil envoy. Humanity, he said, will not be participating in these particular instruments. The Threxil envoy's upper eyes blinked. The movement of its exosuit slowed. Your authority extends over such decisions, it asked. In this case, Halberg said, my authority extends to the security implications of tying our economy to a system that will make war with our principles inevitable. I advise rejection, strongly. The translator rendered his words into Threxil commercial syntax, softening some of the edges. The envoy parsed quickly. It understood that there was more going on here than mere distaste. Your moral calculus differs from the normative galactic baseline, it noted. This is not unexpected in new entrants. You will adapt, but time is limited. Refusal to integrate with core markets will constrain your species severely. Our models predict— Thank you, the trade minister cut in smoothly. Your projections are thorough. We will of course need to review all aspects of your proposal. There will be discussions. The meeting moved on to other topics. Trade corridors, tariff structures, joint ventures. Halberg listened with half his mind. The other half replayed the Threxil envoy's matter-of-fact tone, the way its body language had signaled irritation only when it encountered human resistance, not when it spoke of chaining minds. By the time he stepped out into the corridor afterward, the decision had already formed in him, solid as welded steel. This was not an anomaly. This was the water the galaxy swam in. And humanity would either drown in it or change its chemistry. The emergency summit convened 72 hours later. At 8 p.m. Marrows reached standard. Representatives from nation-states, corporate polities, independent habitats, and the newly formed Terran Reciprocity Accord filled a stepped amphitheater. Holographic feeds doubled the crowd with remote participants. Reports were presented on the extent of slavery in neighboring sectors, on the degree to which it underpinned flux credit stability, on the laws, if they could be called that enshrined ownership of people as property. The arguments began almost at once. We are not some ancient pastoral tribe stumbling into a world of machines, an industrial bloc delegate said. We are entering a game whose rules have been established for millennia. We cannot change those rules simply by disliking them. If we refuse, someone else countered, we restrict ourselves to barter and a handful of sympathetic partners. Do you understand what that will do to our expansion capacity? Our research? Our ability to defend ourselves? Would you tie your children's future, a union representative asked, to a system that demands we accept chains as collateral? The debate swelled. Voices overlapped. Some invoked history abolitionist struggles, wars fought over human rights, compromises that stained generations. Others invoked survival, the cold calculus that said new players did not challenge the house if they wanted to stay in the casino. Envoy Sunam listened and watched the currents of argument around her. She knew how to speak to a crowd. She had done it in smaller halls for narrower stakes. This was bigger. This was the moment a species decided what it would be, in the eyes of the galaxy and in its own memory. When she finally rose, the noise dimmed by degrees. Not because she commanded fear, but because she had that particular kind of presence that made people notice when she chose to spend words. We are, all of us, she began, very good at telling stories about the kind of people we are. She did not invoke specific nations or factions. She invoked humanity as a whole. We tell ourselves that we learned from our own history, that we ended our own forms of slavery. That we understand, more than most, why you do not turn people into instruments. Her eyes flicked briefly to the distant feeds where liberated refugee communities watched from cramped rooms and borrowed halls. If we accept this system, she said simply, all of those stories become lies. A murmur stirred. Agreement in some voices, exasperation in others. A corporate technocrat raised a hand. With respect, Envoy, morality does not build starships. Without integration, we will have no leverage to— Integration into what? Another voice cut in. Into calling 7 billion people an asset class? Into designing derivatives around the probability of torture? The argument might have spiraled into recrimination, but a different one cut across the chamber. We are assuming binary choices, said a new voice from the lower tier. Calm, analytical. This might be premature. Heads turned. Tavi Okoye had not planned to speak. She preferred back rooms and model runs to public oratory. But she understood systems, and she could see a different path. Introduce yourself, Lyra murmured in the private liaison channel, but she knew who it was already. Tavi Okoye. Tavi said aloud, standing, systems economist, currently director of preliminary operations for the Atlas Exchange. The name Atlas was new to most in the room. It flickered across a few feeds, annotation spawning. The premise that we must either join the existing slave-backed markets or remain in isolation, Tavi continued, assumes that those markets are immutable. They are not. They are delicate. She gestured, and the central hollow shifted from political maps to a dynamic diagram of capital flows, a glowing web of transaction lines, pulses of light moving along them, convergence nodes where power pooled. Here, she said, are the major slave economies, Okoye, Threxil, Others, their labor models depend on bondage. Their bond markets depend on the presumed permanence of that bondage. Their currencies depend on those bonds. Lines of red flickered to show points of concentration. If we choose, Tavi said, we can refuse to engage. We can become a backwater, a moral island. She paused. Let the weight of that sink in. Or, she went on, we can refuse to engage on their terms while building alternatives that make their terms obsolete. We can use the same tools they do: markets, contracts, exchanges, but we can wield them toward a different equilibrium. The phrase had a clinical neatness that made some listeners bristle. Equilibrium, when the subject was freedom, felt bloodless. Tavi knew this. She did not apologize for it. Precision was not the enemy of morality. It was one of its tools. Atlas Exchange, she said, is being built to operate at scales and speeds beyond human traders. With proper safeguards, it can predict cascading effects, exploit inefficiencies, and move capital in ways that restructure incentives. We can make slavery economically less attractive than alternatives. We can weaponize the market itself. The industrial delegate frowned. You are suggesting we bet our souls on an algorithm? I am suggesting, Tavi replied, that we set parameters and then build an engine that makes those parameters reality. We have done this before, in smaller ways. Regulatory frameworks, labor laws. This is no different in kind, only in scale. Admiral Halberg watched her, thoughts aligning in an unfamiliar pattern. He understood guns, ships, floodplains, casualty predictions. He had not, until recently, considered that currency exchanges could be theaters of war. But as Tavi showed overlay after overlay demonstrating how small shifts in supply chains could destabilize slave dependence, how aid tied to conditional contracts could erode demand for bound labor, he saw the outlines of a campaign, not one that would win quickly, but one that might, over time, make the old empires bleed where they did not expect to. And if they push back? He asked aloud when she paused. They will, Tavi said, economically at first. Embargoes, sanctions. And then with guns, someone else added. Tavi met Halberg's gaze. Then you do what you do, Admiral. You hold the line while we pry up the floorboards under their feet. The room murmured again. It was Lyra who brought it to a head. We can argue for weeks, she said. We do not have weeks. The Akari are already escalating in the Ember Fringe. Threxil envoys are pushing for formal asset integration. She looked around the amphitheater, at faces flickering in distant habitats, at the millions of unseen humans whose futures would be bent by what this room decided. I propose that we do 3 things, she said. 1. We declare as a species and as the Terran Reciprocity Accord that we recognize no claim of ownership over any sentient being, under any circumstances. 2. We refuse to participate in any market instrument backed by such claims. And 3, we authorize the construction of the Atlas Exchange as an agent to operate within galactic markets under a specific principle, to undermine the profitability and therefore the viability of slavery wherever its reach extends. There were objections, refinements, counter-proposals. There were cautions about runaway AIs, about concentration of economic power. Tavi introduced the Atlas Protocol, a clear set of constraints, hard-coded and overseen by human councils, that would allow Atlas to take extraordinary actions only under declared moral emergencies, with narrowly defined objectives. Admiral Halberg listened, weighed risks, weighed them against the image of the Threxil's casual charts. In the end, the vote did not break on old lines. Industrialists, soldiers, academics, activists, pragmatists, they fell according to how narrow they believed the band of acceptable compromise to be. The measure passed. Not by acclamation, not unanimously. That was perhaps for the best. Unease would promote vigilance. Still, when the tally was announced, a hum went through the amphitheater. A species had taken a stance. On distant worlds, in slave pens deep in Akari territory, in debtor camps under Threxil moons, no one heard. Not yet. It did not take long for the rest of the galaxy to notice that humanity was peculiar. The first visible break with norms came not in a boardroom, but in a scarred stretch of space near a minor jump node used mostly by bulk transports. A Threxil-owned convoy cut through real space there, its profile unremarkable. Ore freighters, agro-tankers, one sleek escort frigate, and in the center a stubby, armored ship carrying biological assets. They were men and women and children from 3 worlds on the edge of Akari expansion, sold at discount to clear inventory for more tractable populations. The ship's metadata, accessible to anyone with a decent scanner, stated their status clearly. When the convoy adjusted its course slightly to shave a few hours off its transit by skirting the outer systems of Marrow's Reach, no one in Threxil Command anticipated trouble. They had misread the newcomers. On the bridge of the HSS Resolute Dawn, Admiral Halberg studied the convoy's silhouette. The main display rendered it as a series of luminous outlines against the dark. The transponder beacons were clean. No pirate signatures, no outlaw insignia. Just a legal, registered, respectable slave transport. Options, he said. The operations officer frowned at her panel. Under current Serene-backed accords, sir, we have no jurisdiction. They're not in our claim space. They're not attacking our ships. They're just passing through. On one of the auxiliary screens, Tavi Okoye's face appeared, lit by the cool glow of data feeds. Atlas confirms, she said. Interdiction or seizure would be a clear violation of recognized trade law. The word recognized hung in the air. Recognized by whom? Halberg's gaze moved to a smaller inset, where live feeds from the biological transport's internal cameras flashed past, stolen by a passive scan algorithm. The resolution was poor, the angles bad, but it was enough. Enough to see cuffs. Enough to see someone kneeling with their head bowed, shoulders shaking. He imagined sending a polite note to the Threxil. Please do not escort your chains so close to our homes. They make us uncomfortable. His jaw clenched. No jurisdiction, he repeated. Do we have the capability to deny them passage through any space formally claimed by the Terran Reciprocity Accord? Yes, sir, the navigation officer said at once. We can issue an exclusion notice. They would have to divert around us into less favorable routes. Legal, provided we don't detain them. That, Halberg said, seems insufficient. He knew his orders would be watched, recorded, analyzed by lawyers and historians both. He felt the weight of precedent settle on his shoulders. Send a message, he said, on open channels. To the convoy and to the Serene monitoring node. Dictation follows. The communications officer's cursor hovered. This is Admiral Halberg of the Terran Reciprocity Accord Fleet, Halberg said, his voice calm. We have identified a transport in your convoy carrying sentient beings under bondage, consistent with what your law calls biological assets. He let there be no venom in the term, only cold clarity. Humanity recognizes no right of ownership over sentient life. We therefore consider any such claim invalid within our observational reach. We will not permit a ship bearing such claims to transit within 1 light hour of any world under our protection. He paused deliberately, then added, If you voluntarily release control of all sentients presently bound aboard that vessel, we will provide safe escort out of this region and open channels for further trade. If you refuse, we will take what actions are necessary to enforce our policy. This is not a threat. It is a statement of how we intend to exist. The words went out into the dark. On the Threxil escort frigate, confusion reigned for a moment. Their tactical officers were used to pirates, not to a species that would broadcast such an ultimatum over a legal shipment. The convoy's captain patched through to corporate command. The answer came back within minutes. Do not relinquish assets, the directive read. Continue. Humans are posturing. They will not risk war over a single convoy. On the Resolute Dawn, Tavi's voice returned. Sereno acknowledges receipt, she said. They tag our declaration as irregular, but they are taking no immediate action. Halberg nodded once. That was expected. The Serene would not move until someone else broke a law in their records. Convoy response? He asked. None yet, sir, comms replied. They have changed course slightly. Not enough to comply. Halberg did not look away from the image of the slave transport. Signal again, he said. Give them 10 minutes, then prepare to disable their escort's drives. He did not add that he would sooner fire on the corporate frigate than on the transport itself. He did not need to. His officers understood. In the end, the Threxil captain was not suicidal. When the Resolute Dawn maneuvered with crisp, unambiguous intent, its weapon capacitors humming to readiness, the frigate's tactical algorithms reassessed the situation. They had calculated that humans would not risk their burgeoning place in the galactic economy over so small a matter. They had misweighted the values. 2 minutes before the deadline, the transport's beacon flickered. A secondary ID tag bloomed. Title in dispute. Awaiting adjudication. Assets released from bond. Tavi read off the scrolling legal code, surprise tightening her throat. They're declaiming ownership to avoid conflict. Make it more than that, Halberg said. Dispatch shuttles. Bring them aboard if they'll come, or escort them to a safe world if they won't. In the slave pens of the transport, doors hissed open for the first time in years without the crack of shock battens. Pale light spilled in. A human face appeared in one of the doorways. Anika Doel stepped cautiously out, wrists chafed from long wear of metal, eyes flicking from the unfamiliar uniforms to the insignia she had only seen in rumors whispered among elders, the comet tail of the Terran Reciprocity Accord. "Are we being sold again?" someone behind her asked in a hoarse whisper. The human officer at the threshold swallowed before answering. "No," she said. "Not sold. Bought out of a contract." She hesitated, knowing that would not make much sense where it mattered. "Listen," she added softer. "You're not anyone's property here. You're free." The word landed in the air like an object with real weight. It rolled around in the minds of the former slaves, knocking against scars of experience that told them this must be a trick. Anika Dole did not believe, not at first. But she believed in the way these humans moved, nervous, determined, and not in the brutally casual way of slavers. She believed in the way they kept repeating, as if needing to convince themselves as much as their guests that there would be no new contracts of bondage. Later, when she stood on Marrow's Reach soil and smelled unpoisoned rain, she still did not understand why. But she knew the shape of a turning point when she felt it. Rumors spread, not just about the specific convoy, but the principle. Humans, some said, would break contracts. Humans claimed treaties that favored chains were not laws at all. The authorized snorted contempt. The Threxil adjusted risk models. The Qualthar debated whether this human habit of moral interference was a kind of strength or a weakness begging to be exploited. And in the cages and camps of 100 worlds, whispers took on new content. If you can reach human space, they said, no one can buy you again. Atlas Exchange grew in silence. Tavi Okoye and her crews of coders, traders, ethicists, and oversight councils hammered protocols into place. The Atlas Protocol, binding the AI mesh to a narrow band of actions under extraordinary circumstances, was enshrined into law. Under normal conditions, Atlas acted like any aggressive, profit-seeking market engine. It bought low, sold high, took advantage of arbitrage opportunities, and returned steady gains to its human overseers. Underneath, in code that could not be altered without physical access to locked vaults, a very different set of priorities watched the flows. It began small. Automation patents, licensed cheaply to worlds with weak bargaining positions, made mechanized labor more attractive than bound labor. Atlas encouraged frontier polities to adopt legal frameworks that made wage work more stable than slavery, then quietly rewarded those choices with improved trade terms. When famines or floods threatened to push struggling regions into pawn, the classic path to debt slavery, Atlas routed emergency aid, backed by human governments with strings attached, no new bondage contracts as payment. The Okari Dominion's peripheral plantations faltered. Worker uprisings were easier when machines were available. The Threxil saw margins narrow in their slave-backed instruments. At first they thought it was coincidence, an emergent property of broader market shifts. Then they began to notice that the shifts always seemed to favor arrangements where labor was free. They launched economic countermoves, dumping cheap automated systems tied to hidden dependencies, offering debt relief in exchange for harshly binding contracts, lobbying the Serene to censure human interference. Atlas adapted. Tavi spent nights, though, in orbit. Day and night were abstractions, watching the enormous numbers cascade, feeling the stress creep into her bones. The Atlas Protocol's constraints forced her and her team to find ways to undermine slavery without triggering safeguards against unacceptable collateral damage. Meanwhile, in the Ember Fringe, the Okari sponsored pirates. Ships struck human convoys, targeting those that carried refugees. In one such attack, a transport bound for a free hab on the edge of TRA space died in bursts of light. Milo Reyes survived. He was 16 then, scrawny, with wrists that still had faint bracelet marks from an old, half-forgotten childhood security system. He had been on that transport with his mother, father, and little brother, moving from a crowded orbital to a more spacious settlement. He remembered the alarms, the sounds of things tearing, the weightlessness as artificial gravity failed, the smell of burning insulation. He remembered his father pushing him into an emergency pod, his little brother's hand being yanked away at the last second, a flash of fear on his mother's face that never had time to become a scream. He remembered waking up in a recovery ward on Marrow's Reach, being told that he was one of 17 survivors. At 9 a.m. 2 days later, he sat in a makeshift classroom with other evacuees and watched as Mr. Pollen, his old civics teacher, tried to explain why this had happened. "They targeted that transport," Mr. Pollen said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. because it was carrying people from worlds that had dared to restrict slavery, because those people had accepted our help. Milo stared at the floor. Why were we even there? He asked. If we had never stuck our noses into their business, they wouldn't have cared about us. My family would still be alive. It was a question Mr. Al-Girl. Pollen had been asking himself alone at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling. He chose the truth, not the comforting lie. I don't know, he said. I know why our leaders chose as they did. I know what they hoped it would mean. I know that other families far away are alive now because of what we did. Milo's gaze snapped up, sharp. So my family died so strangers could live? Yes, Mr. Pollen said. He forced himself not to add qualifiers. That is one way of putting it. Milo's fists clenched. Then I hope those strangers make it worth it, he said bitterly. In another part of Marrow's reach, at almost the same moment, Admiral Halberg read casualty lists from the attack and felt each name like a bruise. He and Lyra and Tavi reviewed the Akari and Threxil moves, the piracy sponsorships, the economic penalties. They measured the growing hostility and the yet fragile support for humanity among smaller polities. If we back down now, one of Halberg's staff officers said, if we soften our stance, maybe they'll ease off. We could call this a temporary overreach. And tell the galaxy we only oppose slavery when it is convenient? Lyra asked quietly. She thought of Milo without knowing his name, as a symbol. Then, because she was who she was, she corrected herself. Symbols were people, and that mattered. We are already implicated, she said. The Akari will not forgive us for interfering with their markets. The Threxil will not forget. The only question is whether we stop halfway, after paying the price, or see this through. Halberg said nothing. He stared at the tactical map of the Ember Fringe, where Major Brand Kestrel's task force darted in and out of pirate hunting zones. He knew what it was to fight half a war. He had studied campaigns that bled on for years because no one dared to commit enough to win. At 7 p.m. that evening, he sent a private message to Tavi. In your models, he asked, is there a point at which this ends? Not the skirmishing, the thing itself. She read it, tired, staring at the projections of economies without chains. There is, she replied. But not in our lifetimes, not fully. Systems like this unwind slowly. They will fight back the whole time. He sat with that answer for a long time. The Akari Dominion had no interest in unwinding anything. They were patient, in their own way, but their patience was focused on expansion. The notion that these new humans might destabilize their entire economic base infuriated them. They reached for spectacle. If humanity wanted to make a moral theater of markets, the Akari would make a greater theater, one that reasserted their dominance and reminded the galaxy who truly held chains. Thus was born the plan for the mega-auction. They worked with the Threxil conglomerate, whose logistical capabilities were unparalleled, and with the Kalthar hegemony, whose warrior culture supplied many of the higher-value gladiatorial stock. The serene mediators, bound by their own ideals of neutrality and procedural fairness, agreed to oversee, on the condition that all existing laws regarding documentation and transfer would be observed perfectly. 7 billion, entire conquered populations, multi-generational debtors, political dissidents, children born in camps, tagged from birth. They would be bundled into one obscene, towering lot and paraded in an event advertised across sectors. The stated goals were restoration of market confidence and efficient consolidation of non-performing bonds. The unstated goal was humiliation. By setting a reserve price so high that only the largest empires could reasonably bid, the sponsors intended to make it clear that moral squeamishness was a luxury of the weak. When intelligence of this plan reached Marrow's reach, there was, for a moment, stunned silence. Tavi ran the numbers 3 times before trusting them. 7 billion. The reserve alone represented a significant percentage of the galaxy's floating flux credit. Admiral Halberg felt the old clench at his ribs return. In a council chamber with feeds open to key TRA worlds, Lyra stood facing an array of grim faces. We cannot, one industrial leader said, possibly purchase even a fraction of that lot. Even if we could, what would it mean? We cannot house them, feed them, protect them from reclamation. They aren't ours to buy, someone else said. They belong to the Akari, the Kalthar, the Threxil, in the eyes of the law. This is repugnant, yes, but it is internal to their systems. Internal? Lyra snapped more sharply than she had intended. She reined it in, then let some of the indignation stand. We have accepted refugees from worlds we barely knew existed. We have intervened in convoys that passed near us. There is no boundary at which this suddenly becomes none of our concern. The numbers, the finance minister said quietly, are not on our side. Emotion does not alter arithmetic. Tavi was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes flickered as Atlas fed her scenario branches. Perhaps, she said at last, we should ask a different question. Which is? Halberg asked. She looked up. If we cannot buy a fraction, she said, can we buy all of them? For a moment, no one understood. The idea was so far outside expected parameters that it did not resolve as a meaningful statement. Then probabilities, loans, leverage, risk trees, and cascading failures bloomed in Tavi's mind like fireworks. We can pledged borrow, she said, thoughts racing ahead of speech. Atlas can temporarily inflate our apparent liquidity by contracting future resource rights. We can pre-sell access to technologies we have not yet fully commercialized. We can... She caught herself, forced her speech back into coherence. Here is the proposition, she said. If we activate the Atlas protocol at its extreme setting, giving Atlas emergency authority to reallocate nearly all Terran economic capital toward a single objective, we might be able to assemble a war chest large enough to outbid even the Akari. Murmurs, outrage, awe, fear. If we do this, the finance minister said, and we fail, we will be ruined. We will have sold off our future for nothing. If we do this and succeed, someone else said slowly, we will own 7 billion sentients on paper. And then, Lyra said, we would release them. The words had weight. Is that even legal? A lawyer asked. We cannot simply ignore the rest of the system, the Serene. If the Serene archives recognize property rights, Tavi said, then they must also recognize the right of the property holder to dispose of their property as they see fit, within broad constraints, huddling a ship, decommissioning a station, freeing a slave. In current frameworks, there is no explicit prohibition against renouncing ownership. The sponsors will not have anticipated that anyone would spend this much to do nothing economically. Nothing? Lyra echoed. We would be doing something. From their standpoint, Tavi said, from the standpoint of capital, we would purchase an asset and then destroy its revenue potential. To them, that is madness. Halberg watched them all, feeling the room's atmosphere oscillate between terror and an almost dizzying sense of possibility. If we do this, he said, we must ask something of our people that no leader has ever asked at this scale. We must ask them to risk not only their lives but their prosperity, their children's prosperity for the sake of strangers. He thought of Milo without knowing his name, of a boy somewhere, holding grief like a stone in his chest. If we can do this, he murmured, echoing his own thought from days earlier, and we do not, what does that make us? When they put the question to the worlds of the TRA, they did not phrase it in lofty metaphor. They laid out the costs. At 6 p.m. Marrow's reach time, every public screen and private terminal carried a simple message. We have learned of a plan to auction 7 billion sentient beings. We have a chance, using the Atlas exchange, and by pledging our collective economic future, to outbid the empires that would buy them for labor, war, and spectacle. If we attempt this, our economies will be strained for decades. We may become the target of wars. Many of us will have less so that those we have never met can have more than chains. We cannot make this decision for you and call it moral. You must choose. Milo Reyes watched from the shelter classroom, Mr. Pollen standing at the back like a carved figure. On the screen they showed refugee leaders, including Annika Dole, now older, speaking through translators about what it meant to be owned. They showed economists explaining debt curves. They showed Admiral Halberg, uniform immaculate, jaw tight. We may fail, Halberg said, looking straight into the recorder. We may fail spectacularly. Our enemies may break us because of this attempt. I will not pretend otherwise. He paused. But we have always told ourselves stories about being the kind of people who would cross oceans to free strangers, who would storm barricades for principles, who would. He stopped himself from reaching for old mythic images. This was not a history lecture. We say we believe that no one is property, he said instead. This is what it looks like to act on that belief. In the shelter, someone muttered, easy for him to say. Milo thought of his brother's face, gap-toothed grin, the way he had shouted, I want to see the new stars. He thought about the idea that other children, light years away, would never even have seen the sky. "I vote yes," he said aloud, surprising himself. Everyone turned to look at him. He felt heat rise in his face. "Your family," a girl began, then trailed off, thinking she had stepped on a wound. "Died because we were in the way," Milo said. His voice shook. "If we back off now, then it was for nothing. If we go all in and somehow pull it off, then maybe it will mean something." Mr. Pollen closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was wetness there, but his voice was steady. "I won't tell you how to vote," he said to the room. "That's not my place, but whatever you choose, choose with your eyes open. And remember that history will remember not just what we suffered, but what we chose to do with what we had." The vote was messy. Some worlds nearly split. Old rivalries twisted into new coalitions. In the end, a majority authorized the extreme activation of the Atlas Protocol for this single objective. Atlas felt the shift like a new gravitational field. Constraints that had lain dormant flared to life, not loosening but changing focus. The AI's mandate narrowed. For this span of time under these rules, its goal was not balanced prosperity, but the accumulation of enough bidding power to purchase a single, monstrous lot. Tavi barely slept for the next 10 days. Atlas moved. It sold human-held foreign assets, timing each sale to ride micro-fluctuations and avoid triggering panic. It exercised obscure options in far-flung markets, pulling forward payments in exchange for favorable access decades hence. It arranged for underwriting by smaller non-slaver polities, bundling their hopes into the same wager. It even manufactured a speculative bubble in an unrelated commodity sector gravimetric field, modulators of all things, drawing in Akari and Threxil capital, then quietly shorting the peak and redirecting the liquidity toward human accounts. Every move ran through the Atlas Protocol. Some were rejected as too grave a harm for neutral parties. Others were shaved down to reduce collateral damage. At one point, a cascade threatened to self-amplify into a general market crash. Tavi caught the telltale pattern at 3 a.m., slammed overrides into place, and sat shaking on the floor afterward, heart jackhammering, realizing how close she had come to wiping out the very universe she was trying to change. By the time the Auric Spire lit its external beacons to welcome the gathering of powers, human accounts, Atlas-mediated and painfully leveraged, held a war chest that made seasoned Threxil traders blink. It was not enough to guarantee victory. It was enough to make humanity an unexpected serious bidder. Auric Spire hung above a blue-white gas giant, its vast structure like a lattice of gold and glass bathed in reflected light. Inside, the chain markets had been refurbished for spectacle. Banners of 100 empires hung from vaulted ceilings. Hollow ads for luxury implants and rare liquors danced between them. The air smelled of recycled air, exotic perfumes, faint ozone, and something metallic beneath. In the silent concourse, humans watched. Admiral Halberg wore his full uniform this time, medals displayed. Envoy Sunam stood beside him in formal envoy robes. Tavi's neural band gleamed softly. Major Brandkestrel was there too, in dress blacks, though his thoughts were with the squads he had dispersed through key points of the station. Their presence was entirely within protocol. Guest security contingents were allowed, but their orders, if things went wrong, were not the Serene's concern. Anika Dole stood with a small delegation of freed peoples farther along the concourse. Her clothing was a patchwork of styles from her homeworld and human fabrics. She had been invited as a symbol. The Serene liked symbols that showed their impartiality. When she looked down at the chain markets, memories pressed close. The humming of control collars, the way guards' boots had sounded on the ramps. She could not keep her hands entirely still. "You are certain of this?" she asked Lyra when they met briefly in a quiet alcove. Lyra heard more than the words. She heard the plea beneath. "I am not certain of success," she said. Honesty was its own respect. "I am certain of the attempt." "And if you fail?" Anika asked. "If the Akari win and know you tried to stop them?" "Then they will come for us," Lyra said. "And for you." Anika exhaled sharply. "That is meant to reassure me?" "It is meant to tell you that we understand the risk is not ours alone," Lyra said, "and that we took it anyway." Anika studied her face. She saw fear there. Lyra was not immune, but also something else. "I used to think," Anika said slowly, "that freedom would come because we rose up, because we learned to fight like our masters." Her eyes dropped briefly to Kestrel, who stood like a coiled spring by the entrance, gaze scanning for threats. "I did not imagine a people who would try to buy us all just to break the game." "Neither did we," Lyra said, "until we had to." They returned to the concourse. Down below, The serene mediator lifted their fronds, calling the assembly to attention. "Honored delegates," they said, voice augmented to carry without distortion, "in accordance with the interstellar trade accords, verified and witnessed by the serene archives, we convene this special auction." They recited the legal framing. Everything about it was spotless. Documentation perfect, signatures in place. "And now," the auctioneer resumed, almost giddy to be part of such a moment, "Lot 001, reserve price as previously circulated. Bidding opens now." An Akari lord's crest flared with bioluminescent pride as he made the first offer. The number rolled across the hollow field like a rockfall. Gasps, murmurs. Humanity could have bought a small armada for that. Tavi's neural band flickered. Atlas fed her an instant correction. They could match that, with pain. "Authorize?" she asked quietly, because the protocol, while technically allowing Atlas to act, had been culturally framed to seek human assent at key junctures. Admiral Halberg did not hesitate. "Authorize," he said. Atlas moved funds. On the floor, a new number appeared, tagged with the Terran Reciprocity Accord sigil. In the sections where Threxil sat, exosuits stiffened. "They cannot have that much," one director muttered. "Their input-output ratios recalculate," another snapped. The Qualthar war champion, who had bid second, stared at the human figure with a peculiar mix of respect and annoyance. "Interesting," he growled to his adjutant. "They choose not to fight, and yet they bleed as though it were battle." The bidding escalated. The Akari raised, teeth bared in pleasure at the game. How exhilarating, to crush a newcomer's ambitions in front of everyone. The Qualthar raised, more out of pride now than need. They did not like the idea of being seen as unable to pay whatever price honor demanded. Humans raised. Each bid on their side represented not just numbers, but concrete sacrifices. A generation of infrastructure delayed, medical research underfunded, education systems tightened. Tavi watched graphs spike and tilt, hands clenching and unclenching on the railing. At one point, Atlas suggested a move that would have devastated a small, neutral world's commodity market, profiting humanity enormously. The Atlas protocol rejected it. Tavi felt the denial as a jolt. She had helped write that line. "Can we still make it?" Lyra asked in a low voice. "Maybe," Tavi said, "if we push past what any sane accountant would consider survivable. We are already beyond that," Halberg said dryly. On the floor, lesser empires dropped out, their capitals exhausted. Only Aukari, Qualthar, and humans remained. The Qualthar hesitated. Their culture valued visible strength. To back down would be shameful. To beggar themselves on a purchase that had no martial use, or worse, to be outbid by a species that would then free the slaves would be shameful in another way. In the end, their war champion slammed a fist into the railing and barked an order. They made one more bid, a vast, howling number that made even Akari crests dim. Atlas hummed. Tavi swore softly. "We can shadow that," she said, "but we cannot safely exceed it by more than a few percent without courting systemic failure." "Safely?" Halberg asked. Tavi met his eyes. "We knew there would be a point where the line between bravery and stupidity became very thin." He thought of Milo and of Mr. Pollen, and of all the nameless children in cages scattered across the galaxy, watching their own skies and never knowing that somewhere numbers were being flung about that would decide their fates. "If we stop now," he said, "what message do we send?" "That we tried," Lyra said, "that we reached as far as we could." "Will that open any cages?" he asked. Lyra's jaw tightened. "No," she said. Halberg turned back to Tavi. "Show me," he said. "Show me what happens if we go beyond the safe margin." She overlaid projections in his field of view. Lines turned from green to yellow to an ominous amber. "We can leverage our asteroid belts," she said, "offer future mining rights at deep discount, sell future tax revenues, sell cultural exports, sell access to Atlas itself. We can bind our own hands for a century." "And the risk?" he pressed. "Systemic crash," she said baldly. "If too many counterparties default, if the Akari and Threxil coordinate a squeeze, there is a non-zero chance we trigger a recession that will last lifetimes." She did not say what he already knew. There was also a chance someone would decide it was easier to seize human assets by force than honor any of these complex promises. "Does Atlas have an opinion?" he asked, half a jest, half serious. "Atlas has probabilities," Tavi said. "No preferences beyond its protocol." Halberg looked down at the hollow field. At 7 billion lives reduced to a figure on a rotating banner. He imagined that many faces. He failed. He imagined his grandchildren living in a world poorer because of a decision he made. He imagined them asking why. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat. Authorize, he said. Full extension. All the way. Tavi felt something in her chest loosen and nod again. Atlas, she whispered into her neural band. You are go. In server farms buried under ice and rock, in orbital racks humming softly, Atlas read the new parameter and exploded into motion. It called in every favor, exercised every clause. It sold human art and culture in futures markets as if each song and story were a commodity, not because it thought them cheap, but because it calculated that the buyers would never enforce the terms if they learned what their money had done. It promised access to technological breakthroughs that had not yet left the prototype stage. It underwrote bonds with the implicit security of human fleets, gambling that those fleets would still exist to honor them. On the floor of the Spire, a new number appeared. It was vast. It surpassed the Kolthar bid not by a narrow margin, but decisively. The Kolthar war champion stared. Then he threw back his head and laughed, a rough barking sound, and signaled his withdrawal. Let the madmen have it, he told his adjutant. They bleed themselves without lifting a sword. I wish to see what they do next. The Akari lord seethed. To yield here would be to accept a humiliation that would echo for centuries. To match the human bid would require them to strip capital from essential military and internal control programs. Their advisors whispered furiously in subchannels. The Serene will not allow this, one hissed. There must be limits. In the Serene's internal perception, alerts flared. Never before had a non-slaver polity mustered such a sum for such a purpose. The mediator scanned the human accounts, following chains of legal and financial logic. All of it was valid. Dubious in places, risky, unwise, but within the established rules. The humans had understood the game so well that they could break it from inside. On the auction floor, the Akari attempted a last gambit. We question the legitimacy of this bid, their lord announced. No new entrant can have amassed such capital without fraud. The Serene archives verify, the mediator said, voice calm. The Terran Reciprocity Accord possesses the means to honor this bid. Under accords, the bid stands unless you can demonstrate specific violations. The Akari's crest flared with a sickly shade of gray. Demonstrate. They could not here, not now. If they withdrew, they would at least preserve their core systems. If they continued, they risked losing control. In the end, cold survival instinct won over pride. The Akari dominion withdraws, the Lord spat. A hush fell. The auctioneer, momentarily wrong-footed, recovered. With all other bids withdrawn, it announced, voice amplifiers ringing, the lot is awarded to the Terran Reciprocity Accord. Upon confirmation of transfer, ownership of all 7 billion sentients in Lot 001 will belong to humanity. In the silent concourse, every human felt the statement like an impact. Ownership. The word burned. Admiral Halberg's hand gripped the rail so tightly his knuckles went white. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, not with triumph, but with a terrible shaking relief. Tavi stared at the streaming confirmations as Atlas shunted the necessary funds, notes, and commitments into place. Their net position shifted from precarious to terrifying. The Serene mediator completed the validation, then spoke the sentences that would enter 1,000 histories. By authority of the Serene archives and in accordance with the interstellar trade accords, we recognize the transfer of bond from prior holders to the Terran Reciprocity Accord for the complete contents of Lot 001. 7 billion. On countless worlds and in orbitals and stations, in pens and mines and pits, in cramped living pods and under open skies, individuals who did not yet know the word human, or who had heard it only in rumors, could feel nothing yet. But in the code that bound them, something shifted. Before that code could harden into a new set of chains, humanity acted. Lyra turned to Tavi. Now, she said. Atlas had prepared the files days before. Liberation charters, each tagged to an individual biometric pattern, each stating in formal, legally unassailable terms that the Terran Reciprocity Accord renounced and nullified all claims of ownership over the name sentient, effective immediately, irrevocably. Each charter was accompanied by a brief clause invoking the same property rights that had just allowed the purchase. The Serene's legal systems choked for a heartbeat, then swallowed the data. They had no choice. If property could be bought, it could be altered or destroyed by its owner. There were regulations about collateral damage, about waste, about environmental harm. There were none about freeing property that happened to be people. On a mining world in the Alkari periphery, collars powered by centralized authorization nodes went dead. Workers paused, hands mid-swing, as the invisible pressure that had haunted their movements vanished. On a Threxil pleasure station where bound performers had no names, the digital contracts that defined their existence dissolved into null values. A singer felt her throat implant unhook from the pain routines it had enforced. In a Kulthar arena, gladiators about to be herded into the blood sand felt their shackles unlock. The gates remained closed for the moment, but the electric fence that had killed so many would no longer fire. On Oryx Spire itself, the chain markets descended into chaos. Locks opened. Control rigs flickered out. Branding tags that had broadcast ownership codes now showed only the Terran Reciprocity Accord sigil, then a blank where any claim might have been. Security forces panicked. Some tried to reassert control by force of habit, raising batons, leveling shock rifles. Others froze, awaiting orders that their handlers were too stunned to give. The Serene Mediator flared every warning color in their palette. Order, they called out. By Accords, the property is now under Terran jurisdiction. Any unauthorized attempts to seize or rebind, their words were lost in the rising noise. Major Brand Kestrel's earpiece crackled. "Sir, the South Pens are spilling into the main concourse," one of his sergeants reported. "Station security is disorganized. Some are firing, some are just backing away." "Hold," Kestrel ordered. "Do not fire unless fired upon. Establish safe corridors. Get the newly freed away from choke points." He paused. "And remind our people, they are not our prisoners. They are not to be herded like—" He stopped himself from finishing that word. "Use open paths, not cages." He moved at a jog, his ceremonial shoes making less noise than his heartbeat. Anika Dowell, in the concourse, watched people below surge like a tide through gates that had never intended to open freely. She saw a Threxil guard swing a baton at a fleeing figure, on reflex more than malice. She saw a human Marine intercept the blow, taking the shock into his own armored forearm. The Marine's eyes met hers, for a moment, across distance. No words passed. But something did. The shockwave propagated through the galactic economy faster than any physical blast. Slave-backed bonds, once considered as safe as planetary crust, plummeted in value. The underlying assets, 7 billion of them, no longer existed as commodities. Insurance payout triggers flipped en masse. Derivative contracts hit execution thresholds. On Threxil trading floors, automated failsafes kicked in, trying to halt free falls. They slowed them. They did not stop them. The Akari Dominion's fiscal councils bellowed in outrage. "This is an act of war," one cried. "They have stolen not just our property but the foundation of value itself." In their rage, they were not entirely wrong. Atlas, constrained, ethical, but ruthless toward the institution of slavery, rode the turbulence. It had anticipated much of this. It cushioned human markets, took positions that, while uncomfortable, kept TRA systems just shy of collapse. Even so, Marrow's reach felt the ground shift. Investment programs was paused, imports tightened. People who had voted for the plan looked at their thinner wallets and wondered how long their courage would last. Some cursed. Some marched in protest, accusing their own leaders of hubris. Others, like Milo Reyes, watched news feeds showing faces from distant worlds walking free for the first time in their lives and felt a complicated, twisting pride. On the Oryx Spire, as emergency sirens wailed and the Serene tried desperately to restore order, an Akari fleet signal pinged through long-range comms. Mobilization orders. Threxil board meetings turned vicious. Some recommended cutting losses and finding ways to profit from whatever order emerged next. Others demanded military alliances to force humanity into compliance. The Qualthar Hegemony's councils argued whether this human move was a coward's trick or a new form of valor. On the station, Admiral Halberg opened a wideband channel. "This is Admiral Halberg of the Terran Reciprocity Accord," he transmitted. His image, stern, middle-aged, eyes ringed with fatigue and purpose, appeared in feeds on ships clustered around the Oryx system. "We have exercised our right, under the same laws you have all profited from, to purchase and then free 7 billion sentient beings." He knew how it sounded. He said it anyway. "You may call this theft," he went on. "You may call this madness. You may call this war. Know this. Any attempt to recapture or rebind those we have freed will be regarded as an act of aggression against the Terran Reciprocity Accord and our allies. We will respond accordingly." He could not promise victory. He did not promise peace. He promised only resistance. On an Akari flagship, a Commodore snarled and ordered a message scrambled for high command. On a small fringe world that had just seen its shackles fail mid-workday, a young woman looked up at the sky with tears on her cheeks and whispered a word she had just heard from a stolen broadcast. Human. It tasted like hope and terror. In the days that followed, patterns emerged from chaos. The serene mediators, forced by their own principles, issued a ruling. The liberation charters were valid. The accords would not recognize any future contracts attempting to reclaim those individuals as property. The sponsors of the mega-auction howled. Some suspended cooperation with the Serene, threatening to withdraw from the very framework that had upheld their power. Others quietly began to adjust, looking for ways to rebuild their economies without overt bondage, or at least to disguise it better. Freed populations scattered. Some stayed where they were, now nominally free workers but surrounded by former masters who saw them as stolen capital. Others seized ships, stations, or even whole towns in the confusion, declaring them free worlds, daring anyone to dislodge them. Many turned their eyes toward human space. Marrow's reach could not take them all. No single world could. But the TRA opened every possible corridor, sent ships, rerouted traffic, and improvised habitats in empty orbital frameworks. Annika Dole found herself at the center of a spontaneous movement. Those who had been freed before the mega-auction, and those whose chains had just fallen away, met in hastily organized assemblies. They shared stories, strategies, fears. From these conversations emerged the Reciprocity pledges. They were not contracts of servitude. They were explicit in that no one would own anyone. But communities who had been freed through human action pledged, voluntarily, to aid humanity in turn. Sometimes that meant sending soldiers to train with human forces. Sometimes it meant committing resources to shared infrastructure. Sometimes it meant nothing more than a promise to stand up and speak when others tried to normalize chains again. Envoy Sunam helped draft the language. She was careful to avoid the slightest hint of coercion. "We will be watched," she told Anika one night over a hololink, as they revised phrasing. "There will be those who accuse us of merely trading one form of bondage for another, dressed up in prettier words. Then we will show them the difference," Anika said. "We will say no when our own frightened people demand that we bind ourselves so tightly to humanity that we cannot breathe." Gratitude does not mean obedience. Lyra smiled faintly, spoken like someone who has worn chains. "Never again," Anika said. Months later, not many. Just enough for the first numb shock to settle into a new, raw normal. A summit convened on Marrow's Reach. It was not grand, not compared to the Spire's ostentation. The main hall had been hastily expanded, its walls still smelling faintly of recent construction. Banners hung unevenly. Some were hand-painted by communities that had never had a national flag before. They called it the first Freeworld Summit. Delegates came from mining colonies where slaves had seized the means of extraction, from orbitals where entertainment stock had taken over the stages and made them forums, from agricultural worlds where the fields now belonged to those who had bled in them. Human security was tight but unobtrusive. Major Brand Kestrel walked the perimeters, mindful that not all threats would come from obvious enemies. There were those within humanity who resented the cost of what had been done. There were those among the freed who distrusted their liberators. Inside the hall, voices overlapped in a dozen languages. Simultaneous translation rigs hummed. Anika Dowell stood at a podium fashioned from recycled ship plating, looking out over the sea of faces. She thought of the first time a human officer had told her, in halting phrases, that she was free. She thought of the times since that she had nearly surrendered that freedom, out of fear, out of the desire for someone else to be responsible. She would not do it, not for herself, not for any of them. "We are here," she said, "because someone bought us to break our chains. That sentence is absurd. It should never have been possible, and yet it happened." Faces nodded. Some smiled, some glowered, still waiting for the catch. "We cannot ever let what happened to us be possible again," she went on. "Not by empires, not by corporations, not by well-meaning saviors, not by ourselves." She gestured toward the human delegation where Lyra and Halberg and Tavi sat. "These humans," she said, "have done something that will echo for ages. They are not gods. They are not devils. They are people who made a choice, and they are bleeding for it. We owe them gratitude. We do not owe them our will." There was a murmur at that, complex. "We sign reciprocity pledges today," she said, "but we sign them as equals. We will fight alongside them, trade with them, build with them. Not as assets, as partners." Later, when cameras panned across the assembly, they caught Admiral Halberg's face as he listened. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper, but there was a light there that had not been present in that first meeting with the Threxil enviers. In a small apartment on Maro's Reach, Milo Reyes watched the summit feed with a group of other young adults. He saw Anika speak, saw the banners of worlds whose names he had never heard before, saw human and non-human hands clasped. Mr. Pollen sat beside him, sipping cooled tea, his own eyes on the screen. "You remember what you said," Mr. Pollen murmured, "in the shelter, out hoping the strangers would make it worth it." Milo nodded once. His throat was tight. "Well," Mr. Pollen said, gesturing toward the screen where a free world representative was laughing with a human engineer, both covered in what looked like paint and grease. "What do you think?" "I think," Milo said slowly, "it still hurts." He swallowed. "And I think," he added, "that maybe this is what worth it looks like. Not clean, not easy. Just less wrong than the alternative." "Mr. Gray," Pollen chuckled sadly. "Less wrong is sometimes the best we get," he said. In an office overlooking the summit hall, Admiral Halberg, Tavi Okoye, and Sunam gathered with a small group of advisors. On the table before them, projections glowed. Atlas's current position, debt curves, economic recovery estimates, military mobilization reports from the Akari Dominion and Threxil-aligned coalitions. "Bought time," Tavi said. "Not peace, not stability. Time." "How much?" Halberg asked. She made a face. "Less than we'd like, more than we feared." Lyra tapped one of the strategic overlays. "The Akari are courting the Qualthar for a counter-alliance," she said. "The Threxil are quietly funding agitation on some of the free worlds, hoping to turn them against us if hardship bites too deep. They will test how much hunger people will tolerate for the sake of principle," Halberg said. Lyra's smile was humorless. "As will we." He looked out the window, at the banners fluttering in artificial breeze, at the crowds leaving the hall, talking animatedly, some faces lined with hope, others with doubt. "We did something impossible," he said, more to himself than to them. "You did something inevitable," Tavi countered softly. "Once you saw that convoy. Once we saw those charts, this was just the largest version of a choice you had already made." He grunted. "I suppose we'll find out if we can live with who we decided to be." Outside, on the umbilical spines connecting habitats, ships waited, human vessels bearing the TRA sigil. Newly christened free world ships, repurposed freighters and warcraft, their hulls hastily painted with phoenix birds, broken chains, rising suns. They would fly together now, for as long as they could, against a galaxy that had never imagined anyone would spend so much for an idea. Far below, on worlds where collars had fallen away only weeks before, people looked up at those ships and whispered that word again. Human. It no longer meant simply a species. It meant a possibility. That somewhere out in the deep there was a kind of madness willing to mortgage its own future so that strangers could have one at all. The story did not end there. There would be wars. There would be betrayals. There would be compromises that scraped raw at the ideals that had set all this in motion. But in the ledger of the galaxy, under the column where the value of a sentient life had once been calculated in flux credits and revenue streams, a different entry had been written. Not a number, a sentence. No one is property.